Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of NIMH. 7 dead rats. From a birdcage, Mrs. Frisbee watched the Fitzgibbons eat dinner. There was a dinner for her, too. Breadcrumbs, cheese, and bits of carrot on the floor of the cage, along with a small bowl of water. The cage had been occupied for a few months before by a yellow canary named Porgy, who had lived for 5 years and then died of old age. To get out from under the colander, Billy had to slide a piece of cardboard underneath it, pinching her foot sharply in the process, so that it hurt when she walked. She had been transferred first into a shoebox. "Can I keep it?" Billy had asked his mom. "What for? It's just a field mouse." "For a pet. I like it." Billy had tried to look at Mrs. Frisbee through some holes that he had punched at the top of the box. It was pretty dark inside. "I suppose so. For a few days you'll have to feed it. I think I'll put it in Porgy's cage. I can't see it in this box. It must be hungry. It was trying to eat Dragon's food. What a dumb mouse. It might have been killed." No one had noticed a small torn piece of paper at first. Then Mrs. Fitzgibbons had absently picked it up and tossed it into the wastebasket. A few days! Mrs. Frisbee felt sick. And after a few days, then what? Would they let her go? Would Billy plead for a few more? But even if they had set her free, her children were alone. The rats were coming tonight to move her house. Why had Billy picked today of all days to sit on that stool? She had not the heart to heat the food that lay on the cage. She felt like weeping. Paul came in for dinner, followed by his father. He looked at the cage. "Why don't you just let the poor thing go?" he said to Billy. "That poor little thing, it's scared to death." "No, it's not. It's used to being in a cage." "I bet it'll die." "I bet it won't." "You can't just put a wild animal into a cage. You have to catch them when they're still babies." "They do it in zoos." "Yes, but they know more about it. Anyways, a lot of those die too." "It's strange that it was here at all," said Mrs. Fitzgibbons. "I haven't seen any signs of mice. I don't even think we had any." They sat at the table and Mrs. Fitzgibbons served the stew. It was a long square cut from farm table, big enough to feed, besides the family, the 4 hired hands who would be working with Mr. Fitzgibbons during the planting and harvesting. Fitzgibbons sat together around one end of it. Mrs. Frisbee's cage hung from a metal stand in the corner on the opposite side of the room, quite high enough so that the floor where she crouched was above their heads. She could watch them looking down, but she retreated to the far side of the cage so that they could not see her, nor she could see them. She kept hoping that Paul would resume the argument with Billy and win it, or at least convince Mr. and Mrs. Fitzgibbons that they should let her go. But Paul was busy eating now. So, moving quietly, she crept to the back of the cage. There was a sliding door halfway up, which Billy had lifted to put her in. Remembering Nicodemus's story, she looked at it, wondering if she could climb to it. If she could get it open, or she could get it open if she did. Not now, but later, when they had left the kitchen, maybe. But it looked quite big and kind of heavy. She thought about her children again, and surely, when Justin had been waiting a little longer, he would realize that something had gone wrong. He would go and talk to them. But what would he tell them? "Children, your mother went to the kitchen with Dragon, and she hasn't come out." No, but whatever he said, they would be dreadfully frightened and worried. Poor Cynthia, poor Timothy, poor all of them. She had one small satisfaction. Dragon, who had been admitted after she was safely caged, had eaten his bowl of cat food greedily, sleeping powder and all, purring as he licked the scraps from the bottom of the cage. Billy was looking at the cage. "There," he cried. "It's walking. I saw it. I told you it's all right." And he started up from the chair. "Billy, stay in your place and eat the stew," said Mrs. Fitzgibbons. "The mouse can wait." "Speaking of mice," said Mr. Fitzgibbons, who had driven out to the town that afternoon, "there was quite a stir today at Henderson's hardware store." "About mice?" "No, but nearly. About rats. I went in to order a new linchpin, and there was quite a group of people there, talking about all the odd things that happened. It seemed that 6 or 7 rats got themselves electrocuted there a few days ago. It was very strange. Henderson sells motors. He has a whole shelf of them. The rats, for some reason, had gotten on the shelf. He says it looks as if they were fooling around with one of the motors, trying to move it." "That's a new one," said Paul. "Rats trying to steal motors." "They weren't really, of course. Anyway, it happened during the night, and when he Henderson came into the shop in the morning. He tried to turn on the lights, but the fuse was blown. He found the rats all grouped around the motor. It had been left plugged in, though, and it was turned off. They must have gnawed at the insulation for some reason. At least that's what he's thinking. They caused a short circuit, and all bunched together like that, the current went through all of them and killed the entire lot. Pretty good kind of rat trap, I'd say, Mrs. Fitzgibbons remarked. Mrs. Frisbee was now listening to the conversation very closely. Dragon had stretched out on the floor, looking drowsy. Wait, said Mr. Fitzgibbon. That's only the beginning. It seems that the local weekly was hard up for news. They heard about it and sent their reporter over. Reporter Fred Smith, said Mrs. Fitzgibbon. Yes, Fred. He wrote a little article about it, with the headline, Mechanized Rats Invade Hardware Store. Something like that. Well, it attracted more attention than he expected. The next thing he knew, believe it or not, the federal government wanted to come in. They sent a squad over there from the Public Health Service with a truckload of equipment. Just on account of 7 dead rats, said Billy? They should send a truck over there. We've got more than that here. That's just what I said, Mr. Fitzgibbon went on. And do you know they're going to come here, too? I was totally joking, of course, but the man in charge of the group didn't take it a joke at all. He wanted to know where the farm was, how far away, how many acres, what I raised, how many rats I thought there were. He acted really interested. It seemed they wanted to examine the dead rats at the Henderson, but they couldn't. He'd already sent them to the town dump and they were being incinerated. I never heard of such a thing, said Mrs. Fitzgibbon. All that fuss over a few dead rats? I have, said Paul, and I bet I know what they're after. What? They think the rats have rabies. They don't like to say that because it makes people panicky. What's rabies? Asked Billy. A disease, said Mr. Fitzgibbon, a very bad one, spread by animals. You know, Paul, I think you're probably right. That should explain why the Public Health Service is at it. Epidemic control. Anyways, they're planning to check on the rats all over this area. Don't you remember Paul said a few years ago when everybody had locked up their dogs? And some people were shooting every dog that they saw? That's why they keep quiet until they're for sure. And another thing, they taught us in the vet course in school that when an animal starts acting strange, it might be a sign of rabies. Well, chewing electrical wires? That's a little bit strange. And they think some rats might be infected. Mrs. Fitzgibbon sounded pretty worried. I suppose they must, said Mr. Fitzgibbon, though they never mentioned rabies at all. When are they going to come here? Day after tomorrow, Saturday morning. The man in charge, a doctor somebody, said that they had to do some more checking to do the town tomorrow. They're going to come with an extermination truck. Cyanide gas, I think. I can tell them where to look, Paul said. Me too, said Billy, under the rose bush. That's right, said Mr. Fitzgibbon. In fact, they'll probably want to bulldoze that bush right over. I can do that with a big tractor. Bulldoze my rose bush, said Mrs. Fitzgibbon. They will not. Look at it this way, her husband said. I've got to get rid of those rats anyways. I already decided to do that. They're stealing too much food. Seeds, more and more each time. If I paid an exterminator to do it, he'd charge a couple $100. The government will do it for free. Why not let them? Well, said Mrs. Fitzgibbon, still not soothed, then you can spend that money to buy me some new rose bushes. And that's just what I had in mind, said Mr. Fitzgibbon with a smile, and maybe some lilac bushes, too. Mrs. Fitzgibbon had always wanted a lilac bush. They were her favorite shrubs. Mrs. Frisbee did not believe at all that the rabies were what men were looking for. She wished Mr. Fitzgibbon had been able to remember the name of the doctor somebody, and now she had another urgent reason to get out of that cage. Somehow, she had to warn Nicodemus. Dragon slept on the kitchen floor.